Recently, I picked up a copy of a wonderful book of poetry at an antique store here in Lubbock titled, I Hear America Singing, an anthology of folk poetry. The book was published in 1937, and the poems in the book were collected by Ruth A. Barnes. The book features an introduction by Carl Van Doren. In that introduction, Carl Van Doren says this: Although not all these poems are meant to be sung, most of them, if not sung, are better when spoken than when read. The bare words may look thin on a page. They need the sound of a voice to give them volume. That is, they are folk poems, aimed rather at listeners in eager gatherings than at readers in quiet solitude. This is an ancient way of poetry. There were poets and listeners long before there were printers or readers. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Jerry Brooks. Known to most of her friends as Brooksy, Jerry Brooks is a former coal miner and one of the most respected reciters of cowboy poetry. I sat down with Brooksy in my living room here in Lubbock, Texas, and recorded this interview. Brooksy spent 26 years of her life as a coal miner in Utah, and I asked her to tell me what it was like to be a woman working in a coal mine. Here's Jerry Brooks.
Actually, I don't remember exactly how long it was, but I think it was about the first 2.5 years I worked underground. It was against the law for women to work underground in Utah, but it was actually considered to be a blue law, and it got changed. Workforce top number of underground employees at that mine during the time I was there was about 260, strung out between the 3 shifts and weekend maintenance crews. And the most women that were there at any one time was probably half a dozen, 6 women. And usually only 2 or 3 of us, 3 or 4 at any one time strung out in there. I was only confronted by 2 individuals over the years, over the 27 years, that actually really said anything negative to my face about a woman having a job in a coal mine. For the most part, and I don't care what job it is and whether you're a man or a woman, if you want to do the job, you do the whole job and do it to the best of your abilities. You know, you have signed a contract, and there are expectations of that contract. And so long as you do the job, and all of it, don't expect any, slide here and there. Because, well, you're going to have to give your partners help all the time anyway. But so everybody gets help. But so long as you get the job done and don't expect your physical strengths in some circumstances to keep you from doing what's required of you, then there's no problem. I feel like I earn the respect of the guys the men that I worked with, and for the most part, it was a non-factor.
Was there a sense of, when you're going underground every day, just the danger? Was there a sense of that you're working and living in a...
Well, that's a completely individual thing, what your mindset. At this day and age, there's so much training and just pound safety, this, safety, that, into everybody's brains that, like I said, when I first started talking, there are coal miners and there are people that have a job in a coal mine. And I imagine that's true of just about every job. Personally, I felt safer in that mine than I did on the interstate getting to and from it. Different people have different concerns. Me, I liked being underground. And where I started out on the belt lines, most of my time was spent alone. It's a very good opportunity to more or less come to an understanding with the mountain. You are as safe in a coal mine as you make yourself. So long as you are aware of where you're at and what you've got around. Okay, we don't have x-ray visions. You can't. I had a very good feeling. I had a feel for bad top. It was like having a barometer in your head. You get under some top that's starting to slack up in the upper layers and come apart. You get a little void up in there before it decides it wants to belly out and come down. And it's like the air pressure. There's a reverberation, and I could feel it. I'd step underneath it so long as it was quiet. It doesn't work if there's a lot of equipment going on, but out by areas and escape entryways, return airways, and that kind of thing, there's a reverberation there that. Well, it's just like the bass on the speaker, more or less, but it's hitting you in the head. And you just take a couple steps and you get that feeling and you stop. And you check top with a sounding stick and that kind of thing. You go to thumping on it with a brass ball on the end of a wooden stick. Now, that's all bad already. There's no need to go thumping on, obviously bad top. That's kind of stupid. But when you're mining and you first go into an area that you don't know anything about, you tap that top and you're feeling and listening for the echo and the vibration and the sound of the top as when you strike it. You can put if the top's low enough, you put your hand up there while you're thumping on it, and you can feel that mountain. I mean, there's a lot of potential energy around you all the time. Dynamic forces are at work. And but as far as going underground fearful, I'm sure there's men that prayed every day before as they were going underground or beforehand. It didn't bother me. Yeah, I liked being underground. I actually liked the work. There weren't too many jobs that I did not do, as well as I started out on the belt lines. I went to the face. When you start out on the bull gang, which is a maintenance crew that supports the mining crews, gets everything set up, hauls supplies, does any more roof bolting needs to be done, advances ventilation, moves equipment forward, advances belt forward, or if you're retreating out, pillaring out, then retreats everything out. By the time we got the long walls in, we weren't pulling pillars anymore. We might split them or something. Shaw was kind of getting away from pulling full pillars in retreat because, it's you're alive when you're pulling pillars. Yeah, you're on your tail. You're a nervous wreck in a pillaring section. That's when you can tell the guys that are working in pillars and have been in there for a few months because you can walk up to them with a matchstick and break it alongside their ear and they'll jump about 3 feet off the ground. Just start looking around, because it sounds like a timber crack. That was old school mining, and you hustled your butt. You stayed warm. It was fun. And when you're on track for a record day production-wise, no matter how you're going about it, it's fun. And but for the most part, it's just continuous, repetitive day-to-day stuff going on. Everybody has their job. When I did finally wind up being a foreman on a mining crew, that was one time, I guess, the woman thing that you asked me about earlier. When I took the foreman's job, people said, "Oh, you just like to tell guys what to do." Well, that's baloney, because that's a mining crew, and they're miners, and they know their job. They don't need to be told what to do. The foreman's main responsibility is to make sure that their men have the tools, training, and equipment they need to mine coal safely and efficiently. Not to tell them what to do. Unless there's unusual circumstances come up, when a decision has to be made, when things get ugly, something out of the norm occurs. That's when the foreman comes into play to liaison, make a decision about this situation, or to liaison between the crew and the company, basically.
Coal miners and cowboys seem to have a special kinship. Here's a quote from Australian poet Jack Salmon, who has worked in Australia as both a stockman and a coal miner. When I was a young stockman, I, like other stockmen, worked on cattle stations during the dry season of the year, living in stock camps out on the cattle runs. For 3 months, when it was too wet and hot to be able to work cattle, the stock camps were shut down and the stockmen were paid off. Most of us would head south and got jobs in towns. Mostly we took jobs in mines working underground. Although we had all intentions of giving the bush away and keep working as miners with its high pay and short hours, as soon as the wet season was over, the call of the cattle camps was usually too much, and we would roll our swags and head on out for another season.
It's very difficult for me to describe a coal mine to people that have not been in a coal mine. People that I did take some friends on tour and, took people down there just for a visit, and they were just mesmerized. I had no idea. I mean, you're not getting away. Whatever you've got, that's what you've got. And you're going to deal with it, no matter what. Like Jack Salmon, when I first met him, we got talking in the Big Ben saddle shop in Alpine, Texas. That's where I met him. He spent the same years in the coal mines after a life of droving and cowboying. He went to work in the mines, and we spent basically the same years and the same number of years, him in the mines in Australia and me in Utah. And we mined more coal one Saturday morning in Big Bend Saddlery in Alpine, Texas than had ever been mined in there before or since. And the different jargon that we use, it's not unlike listening to a dally man and a tie hard and fast man talking, and just the different things, the different jargon from the different because terminology will vary from mine to mine, one part of the country to the other. The same kind of things happen. But he and I finally decided, along through the conversation, that cowboys and coal miners got along pretty good, because most of what we were expected to do, a lot of the stuff we were expected to do on a daily basis, most people would call impossible. But since coal miners and cowboys are a little too dumb to realize that, they just go ahead and do it anyway. Mining in the West, and there were so many parallel tracks that the men that came west and who developed the West kind of run on, the miners, the hobos, the cowboys. That whole idea of those parallel tracks, we're headed in a direction for something, but we're going to go about that journey with the abilities we have to hand. But the stories and the working life, as you make that journey, there's just so many similarities. And like Henry Herbert Knipp's The Long Road West talks about the sailors, the cowboys, riding the rails. Does he get miners in there too? He might. But it's the same kind of storytelling, yeah. Same kind of life. Cowboy has a lariat, yeah, and there's ropers and there's ropers. You got to move huge pieces of steel around in an underground tunnel, and you use a lot of chain, and you rig with chain. And there's a lot of similarities about the care and the laying out of a good chain in order to get something rigged correctly as taking care of a rope and knowing how to lay those coils. Where it needs to be in your hand. I look down a chain that I'm going to use that men's lives are depending on. I want every link on that chain straight. I don't want any twists. Every twist you put in a chain weakens a link, binds it up, and puts pressure on that chain. A chain's a machine, yeah, and you're violating the integrity of that machine. I want it right. And then when I hang something up with that, when you're rigging and moving stuff around, you can put a turn in a chain so that as you lift it, that load comes up, you're going to put just enough turn in that chain that it swings into the position you want it in. And you got it where you need it, headed the right direction. Yeah. And that I loved rigging. I loved roof control. I loved rigging on breakdowns. Breakdowns was when it was fun. Because you had to get it unbroke down. Because minutes is money. If you shut a belt line down in the mine with the longwall running, you shut a main line belt off for a minute, 2 minutes, just throw a switch and turn it back on. You've got that longwall down. As the belts start back up, you got that longwall down for 20, 30 minutes minimum. Sometimes it was even longer than that. And 20 minutes, you're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of coal. And that's expensive. So it's tricky for out-by crews and support crews to do the best they can to keep the mining sections running. The worst part of it was when I was on there, first starting out, no longwall in there. This mine was in a big development process. We had the conventional section, and we actually had 7 working faces total. And that's a lot to have going in one mine. So if you had a couple of sections in retreat mining, pulling pillars back out, if those belts went down, there's a man in that machine back in the late 70s and early 80s. That man was in that machine. He's in the back of a lift, and the room decides to cave, and he can't. He's not out of there just because your belt line is shut down. That's a bad situation. You never wanted belt lines to go down when you're pulling pillars. That was pretty crappy, but it got to the point now where men don't mine on board from the continuous mining machine. Everything's run by remote anymore. Coal mining has gotten a lot safer over the years. And like I say, you're as safe as you make yourself. It's your own awareness, your own work habits, your own powers of observation, how well you've been taught, what tools you have to hand. And if we're going to enable the world, if we're going to power the world, which at one time that's what coal did. I've always told people that the only thing a working coal miner ever did wrong was to spoil an entire population rotten on cheap electricity. And it's not that way no more. But as far as I was concerned, I helped to empower this world and make things possible. The other greatest thing about being underground was when you were development mining, you're mining forward in a continuous section, cutting that tunnel. You back out there to advance your ventilation, check your top, check for gas, check your sights, make sure you're still headed the way you want to be headed. When you walk up into that face, you're the first person on Earth to ever stand in that spot and to see what you're seeing right there. Nobody else has ever seen that before. That was the coolest part of working in the face for me.
Many of us who recite cowboy poetry knew Brooksy for years before we ever knew she was a reciter. She would often be in the audience at cowboy poetry gatherings across the West, silently mouthing the words to our poems as we recited. Then one day, she recited on stage and quickly rose to the top as one of the finest reciters of classic and contemporary cowboy poetry. I asked Brooksy if she could remember her first exposure to poetry.
I don't exactly know what the very first... I don't have any one distinct memory of my first exposure to poetry, but unless, of course, it was hymns and Bible verses and children's songs in church school, probably. I think it would just about have to have been. And, music of other kinds. Nursery rhymes, of course. Duh. Yeah, I guess it would have been nursery rhymes, wouldn't it? We always had, literature and poetry around the house. Whole family of readers, basically. The first memory I ever have of reciting a poem in public, I was either 7 or 8. I think I was 7. And I recited The Highwayman. I can remember my brother Cecil coaching me. He has no memory of this. But he coached me when I was trying to learn The Highwayman. I'm sure it was absolutely delightful for the audience to be listening to a 7-year-old's rendition of of The Highwayman. I really don't remember how well it went over. I'm sure I thought it was fabulous. That poem was difficult for me. When I would hit that line that said, plaiting a dark red love knot into her long black hair, I couldn't understand. I didn't know what a love knot was. And I didn't realize that she was braiding ribbon into her hair. And I couldn't see how she could get her black hair to turn into a red knot. So that bugged me. But if I'd stop and ask my brother, how'd she do that? He'd say, shut up and do the poem. And then I got to the part where the landlord's black-eyed daughter. Who blacked her eye? Was the landlord mean? Yeah, why did she have a black eye? Yeah, and my brother would tell me to shut up and do the next line. But I always loved that. I learned to read at a very early age. and I was fairly precocious reader, and I was checking out Jack London books and reading poetry like that. The collection 101 Famous Poems. Are you familiar with that book? It's been around for a long, long time. It's a great collection of poems. I read poetry, yeah. Everything I know is because I read it somewhere. Pretty much, or heard it, but usually it's because I read it somewhere, and it was just always available. Not only were we a family of readers, I'm lucky enough that I lived with a family of storytellers, basic storytellers. Mama's family told stories. She had great family stories that I got to hear over and over and over. My father, being a preacher, he was a storyteller. That's what a preacher is to me, is basically a storyteller. The power of the spoken word, because I could watch my father commanding the attention of all these adults every week. So, it stood for something. And the organ music, because Housatonic, right about that age, when I was about 7, that's where everything just came into focus and coalesced, and I started going, wow, this is what the world's all about. So, and my brother would tell stories. My oldest brother would tell stories to, when he had to babysit me and that kind of thing. So the storytelling aspect of it was always around, and there was music around, there was poetry around. I cannot remember not being aware of the spoken word and the effectiveness of it, the usage of it, and how you used different words, and when it was all right to use some words and not other words. Because there was a rule in our family. My mother, never, she wouldn't cuss no matter what. But the word hell, for example, we were allowed to use because it's in the book. It's in my father's conversation. It had common usage, so it was okay to use it so long as you used it appropriately. Or, for example, the word ass. An ass being a donkey. That's all it is. And so long as you use a word for the purpose you intended it, it's not intended as a cuss word, quote, end quote, then it was all right. And it's kind of funny because you get to other places and into other social situations later where they are considered to be cuss words, hell and damn, but they actually weren't considered to be. We were discouraged from saying them, but if it's in the book, it's fair game. It's a usable word. Now, you knew my mama was good and mad if she said hell spells. That would end, or one of the other expressions that came out of her family. She didn't use it very often, but I always got a kick out of it when she did. It showed up in the stories. She would say, what in the name of all that's holy and damned is going on in here? If you was raising a ruckus or something went clatterty-bang, crash. What in the name of all that's holy and damned is going on? I got a kick out of that one. And, Dad had adjusted his language over the years, and he had a favorite expression that he uses. Well, for crap's sweet sake. I have never heard another person say it. My brother, I made him Google it before I learned how to use the gizmos, and he said, I'd never even thought of that. So he typed it in. We could find no history of that phrase as a commonly used phrase with any kind of history. But, well, for crap's sweet sake, that was just my dad's way of getting it out. And I try to actually sometimes make a conscious effort to use that little saying. But I was introduced to cowboy poetry as a genre and this whole wonderful world of words through a mutual love of Robert Service poetry. I walked in, I met these people. They were retired ranchers down south of Marysville, Utah, and I had gotten to know them a little bit. First time I went out to their house, I walk in the house, and with all the beautiful Navajo rugs, braided rawhide head stalls, Garcia bits, and hats hung on the rafters and walls and everything, there's a little shelf of books up there, and there's 3 volumes of Robert Service poetry. And Susie and I spent pretty much the rest of the afternoon drinking cold beer and playing cribbage and remembering and looking up and sharing our favorite Robert Service poems that we could think of offhand. And she got me into this. And from that time on, after I started going around to gatherings, I started refreshing my own memory because I didn't have a stereo in any of my vehicles. Hour and a half trip to the mine and back from the mine every day, and I started reciting poetry to myself driving to and from the mine. And I always had a pocket full of poems. I'd have 3 or 4 pockets folded. I'd copy them off or write them out on something, and each poem would be folded a different way, so when I reached in my pocket, I didn't have to see it. In the coal mine, I could tell from the way the paper was folded which one I was getting out of my pocket. And sit there and run them through my head. And I had to give up learning poems underground when I took a foreman's position, so that was kind of bad. And then later on, I started driving a vehicle that actually had a stereo in it, and that just ruined me for learning new poems. But yeah, I've done a lot of reciting while driving up and down the road and while working underground. I still find some of those pocket poems going through boxes of old stuff from time to time. A lot of times I'd take them out of my coveralls pocket in the laundry room at home because they were still in there before I threw my diggers into the washing machine, throw them up on the shelf, and sometimes I'd say, okay. So there for a while I was finding stacks of these pocket poems, and they're all falling apart and brown stained, black stained, full of coal dust with holes in all the corners and half the words missing. But they're kind of fun to find. Susie Henry told me about Elko, and she played me Baxter Black cassette. And she had a lot of old Western music, and I'm trying to think if she had any other poetry recordings, but she introduced me to it and gave me books, loaned me books. Not so much poetry books, but John Lomax's cowboy songs, frontier ballads, and We Pointed 'Em North, and her 15 years on the hurricane deck of a Spanish pony. Those were the first 3 books she sent me home with. But talking about the poetry, and she told me about the gathering and everything. And, of course, using some of the old cowboy songs that I'd heard growing up, and then seeing them represented as poems or as songs in Lomax's books, but hearing them both ways and being aware of them in both versions and remembering back to stuff that I had heard as a child. And I said, well, yeah, this stuff's familiar to me, some of it. But those books were just a revelation. So she didn't really provide me with the poetry, the cowboy poetry, but she steered me in the direction of Elko. And if I remember right, that was the 6th year that Elko was going on, was that when Susie was educating me. Yeah. And it took me 6 more years to ever get over to Elko. I believe it was the 12th year gathering was the first time I finally made it over there. And my love of poetry started coming back to me because I had ignored it for so many years, as a teenager, high school. Well, once you get over the teenage angst and the Dylan Thomas and all that, it kind of fell by the wayside when I was trying to make a living, establish a living after school. But through the cowboy poetry, it made me realize my love of all poetry. So, where I was trying to commit the cowboy poetry to memory, and the first few poems actually stuck without my even trying, which encouraged me to start trying to learn them. I had just heard them enough times that one day I discovered I knew them. And then I actually started trying to learn the poems, revitalizing a few of my old favorites from childhood, like Annabelle Lee and the Highwaymen, my captain, Charge of the Light Brigade, Flanders Fields, Grass, a lot of Poe. Poe was one of my favorite poets as a kid. Along with, learning the classic cowboy stuff, and then finally starting to really, really appreciate the contemporary cowboy poetry. So I've been trying to get all kinds stuffed in there, and sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. But yeah, it was a revitalization of my love of poetry, all poetry, and the spoken word, when I started learning about cowboy poetry. And there is an epiphany factor to your introduction to cowboy poetry and attending gatherings. There's a definite epiphany factor when that realization washes over you that this is such a wonderful way to hear stories, such a wonderful way to share stories and communicate the feel of a situation, and which poetry does a lot better than other literary forms. That's an opinion, so. I went and I worked in a dripping mine amongst the rock and the oozing wood. For the dark was lit by a dollar sign, and they told me money was good. So I jumped and sweat for a flat-foot boss till my pockets bulged with pay. But my heart, it fought like a lead bronc horse till I flung my drill away. And the wind, the good free wind, she called from the great divide that the sky was blue and the young years few and the world was big and wide. From the poor bare hills all gashed with scars, I rode till the range was crossed. Then I watched the gold of sunset bars and my camp sparks glinting to the stars, and I laughed at the pay I'd lost. I went and I walked in a city way down a glittering canyon street. For 1,000 lights seemed good and gay, and they said life there was sweet. And the women laughed as the nights reeled by, and the wine ran red and gold. But their laugh was a starved wolf's hunting cry, and their eyes were hard and old. But the wind, the clean, free wind, she laughed through the April rain. Come out and live on the wine I give, in the smell of the greening plain. Oh, I looked back once to the smoky towers where my face had bleached so pale. Then I loped through the lash of the driving showers to the uncut sod and the prairie flowers and the old wide life of the trail. I went and I camped in the valley trees where the thick leaves whispered rest. For love lived there among the honey bees, and they told me love was best. Their twilight lanes were cool and dim, and the orchards pink with May. But my eyes, they'd rise to the valley's rim where the deserts reached away. And the wind, the wild, free wind, she called from the web love had spun to the unbought sand of the lone trail land and the sweet, hot kiss of the sun. Oh, I looked back twice to the valley lass. Then I set my spurs and sung, for the sun rose up above the pass and the morning wind was in the grass, and my horse and me was young.
That's beautiful.
That is a great poem. I've always loved it.
Thank you for sharing.
Well, thanks for letting me do it. Thanks for asking me to
Thanks for taking the time to do this.
take part in this. I hope it all works out for you, Andy. You're doing just great and wonderful things. Thanks a million.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to point out that the poem Brooksy just recited was written by Charles Badger Clark. I'd like to thank Jerry Brooks for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Jerry Brooks at cowboypoetry.com/Brooksy. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying the show and would like to help me keep it going, you can make a donation on my website, or you could leave a rating and a review on the iTunes store, and you could take the time to tell a friend to give the show a listen. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.